Fantastic. We are so grateful to have heard from our very own Baroness Manu Shafiq and Professor Tim Allen, who have us up this morning for what is going to be a fantastic 2 days of panels, two-person dialogues called In Conversation With, interactive workshops, networking sessions, and what we're moving to now, our keynote. We want to remind you all that during the event, we'd like to hear from you, to hear your thoughts and your feelings. So please do feel free to comment using our social media hashtag LSE Africa Summit 21. I sit on the edge of my seat in anticipation of our first speaker. Her work transcends no boundaries as she builds relationships between diaspora communities in the global north and those of us on the continent. She fights valiantly for the rights and visibility of queer, trans, and intersex people of colour. Lady Phyll works in both formal settings, advocating for the human rights of QT people around the world, but also channels her label into building community. And this is evident through the creation of her award-winning Black Pride event. As much as I could outline her experience at length, I will hold my tongue as I humbly welcome to the stage our opening keynote.
Hello, and Maxine, thank you so much for what was a beautiful, warm welcome. And, you know, I must say, we were backstage and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so nervous about coming on. And then we started dancing to the Afro beats, talking about, you know, making sure the hair's laid. And it's a very weird time right now to be still doing virtual events, because you have to think about, do you put a bra on or do you not? How do you keep your pajama bottoms on or do you wear your leggings? So anyway, I am here and it's a pleasure. I'm incredibly honoured to be opening LSE Africa Summit 2021. And as a queer Black African warrior woman, my presence here for me means a great deal. You know, each one of us, really, we know so well the continued discrimination and violence faced by LGBTQ people across Africa and across the world. So in bringing this address to you, I want to acknowledge those who are fighting tooth and nail, personal sacrifice that they're making to create absolute change. And, you know, through my work at Kaleidoscope Trust, which is an international LGBT human rights charity, and also UK Pride, which is the largest celebration of LGBTQ people of colour, so many, inclusive and it's intersectional. It means that I really stand on the shoulders of giants, those that have come before me, those that have been doing the work, continue to do the work whilst they're here. And let us remember that when we're talking about those who are doing the work, let's make sure we give them their flowers whilst they're here, as opposed to waiting till they've gone and, you know, celebrating the greatness that they left us with. So it's really, I meet so many wonderful people and intrepid people who refuse to be quiet or to go away or to stop. So I'm inspired by those who really have come before us. Now, in thinking about this address, I was like, where do I start? Where do I begin? And then in thinking, where would I begin? I thought, where and when? So take it back a bit to when I was a young girl, although I still like to pretend I'm 21, but with a 26-year-old daughter, that's not a possibility. So I remember being a young girl and, you know, speaking so fondly and being so in love with my grandmother. You know, when I think of my grandmother, I see a church. It's not a big church, but it's a church nonetheless, which was hers. This woman was a woman of unshakable faith in her church, as it stands testament to her determination. You know, the path to the church, and this is in Ghana, the path to the church was at the best of times one that led towards community, united in faith and in purpose. And at worst of times, the path was full of obstacles that was so stubborn and very, very frequent. And many would have thrown up their hands and quit, but not my grandmother. My grandmother stayed true to her word. You know, she made sure she took down the weeds, painted the church and just looked after it because it was home to many. You know, she was motivated by more than just her love for God and the blessings that attributed to her persistence, but it was also about that benevolence. She knew that community needed a space that was more than just a place of worship, but was a communion, a place where support groups could meet up, food could be served, and those without be able to not be hungry, and where children could learn what they weren't being taught in schools. She really built a space that was needed because she also called it nothing less than the way of the world, bringing people together. You know, when I think of her, this woman was strong. And, you know, for those in the audience that know African grandmothers, they speak their truth. Now, all of this, my grandmother would never speak English to me. She'd allow me to speak English back to her, but she'd never speak English to me. So it was sometimes in the early stages quite difficult in grappling the language, but you know, she was hard-headed, and I'm glad that she did that. You know, so when I do think of my grandmother, I think of all the things that I learned from her, watching her. There were lessons and attitudes and beliefs and that passed through my mother first, and those that I absorbed chasing on the tails of my grandmother's coat. She was a worker and a grafter and a leader, someone who was so pragmatic, passionate, assertive. There were few men who didn't quiet when she addressed the room, and even fewer with the guts to challenge her in public or private. And as I said, formidable. You know, I try not to over reminisce because I might sit here and glasses will be starting to steam up with the tears, the hot tears of missing how much she meant to me. You know, there was authority in her hips and power in her shoulders, and yet she remained tender and vulnerable. And to me personally, she had that rare ability to be many things to many people simultaneously. And I remember admiring how she was always so busy. And, you know, my questions, my wonder, my teenage dramas, and believe you me, there were quite a few of those teenage dramas, my hopes, my dreams, my concerns, all seemed to land so softly on her ears. And out of her mouth came the hard-earned wisdom, advice and admonishments of a woman who fought for herself and for others. And importantly, she always gave me permission I craved for. And that permission was so needed and so necessary. And it was with the blueprint she drew out for me in my life that helped create the world that I want to create, which is a better place for LGBTQ plus people around the world. You know, so for each of us and future generations live in a world that we deserve, you know, I hope I'm seen to be creating spaces which are by us and for us and that celebrate us. And these spaces should be more common in the thriving and surviving and should be everywhere. You know, I'm leading organisations that are helping to change the way people interact with support, that interact with us and support and stand in solidarity with grassroots activists and community organisers. And I'm in constant conversations with many of our Black brothers, our younger generation, our trans and gender non-conforming siblings, in order to help understand my own thinking about activism and outreach, which continues to, you know, marginalize those most in danger. And like my grandmother, those who admired, I hope I'm leading by example. But the key in this particular moment is the same as it's been since a long before my grandmother was around. But we must prioritize, and I will say this again, we must prioritize Black women. We must organize around dismantling systems of oppression and structures that continue to make such regular and abject violence against Black women, which becomes so possible. Intersectionality is something which really helps make clear the ways the body and our lives as Black women are devalued across the world by those systems, structures, and societies that have rendered us expendable. But intersectionality can also be a lens that really talks to and speaks to us, that enables us to see and acknowledge and appreciate the divinity of Black women. Faced with this profound erasure, I would say the Black woman, still she shines. The Black woman loves and fights, but the Black woman is in danger, although she shines. So let us not forget about the forgotten. Let us never be in silence, because as Audre Lorde says, your silence doesn't protect you. But when we think about the Black woman, she is disregarded and making cultural shifting at the same time, those contributions to the lives of those who orbit around her. And intersectionality calls into play and to pay attention to the violence so that we can end it. And in so doing, I guess, we have no choice but to recognize the human on the receiving end of that violence. And when we recognize them, we have to support them and uplift them. If we remove Black women from the intersectional lens that we speak about, we cause the same harm intersectionality seeks to redress. Intersectionality is not just this legal theory about Black woman you've never known. Intersectionality really demands that Black women's lives and heartbeats and hopes and dreams are named and fought for. I learned from my grandmother that we as African women, and she would never use the word Black, because Black is that social construct that around race, but she always spoke about being African. But she said, as African women, we share between us an understanding of each other's lives. She helped to teach me how life-giving work and supporting each other meaningfully and saying sister, daughter, lover, fighter, mother, warrior, woman, I see you. And today I want to say, especially to my Black sisters, my African sisters, the audience, I see you. And so approaching the address as my grandmother's daughter, the theme for this were, such a powerful theme. Talk about the global crisis as a catalyst of change. I have to ask myself and ask you, which crisis are we talking about? Are we talking about the crisis of racism? Where I've always been reluctant to tell stories of how racism has impacted my life, whether individual instances or the vitriol or the dismissal of a larger structural violence of the state. I never really understood what the point of doing that was and who those stories even serve. One might say that Black people coming together to share how racism impacts us, is important, and it allows for greater understanding on the connection of how we deal with things. But it also relies upon a performance of trauma and pain, and a pain that white people, I will say, have come to revel in wanting to hear stories. And it's not enough that they commit such horrors on us, and this is why I don't talk about the pain, because I have to unlock something that you have to be ready to be able to deal with. But do we really need certain people to hear us retell our stories again and again of the pain and the suffering that we continue to go through? However, perhaps speaking of the instance of racism, may help other Black people understand that they're not alone. And that too is very important. Though I've never felt comforted in hearing these stories, or maybe the telling of the story is the mounting evidence of the obvious, and it might help build a case for some large scale change. And I hope that that's what it does when we talk about issues of racism. So for whatever vantage point I examine, I can't make the sharing of stories of racism make sense. And we should never make racism make sense, because it doesn't make sense. And what bothers me about the requests that are made on my time to tell my story of, how racism impacted me, it never comes with an acknowledgement that these stories might be difficult to tell. That there's an assumption that we're always ready to tell our stories, that reaching back into the little boxes of bringing out our blood-covered stories is so simple as just opening one's mouth. And that is not the case. There are many reasons that experiences remain unlocked, or under lock and key, I should say, not least of which is the frequency of which they happen. If every racist remark, from a cab driver to a waiter to a shop assistant to a colleague, ever made was just knocking around in my head, plucking for the sharing, I would not be able to move through vertigo. I would be rendered standstill and impossible to carry on the fight and challenge all forms of inequality. And perhaps most crucially, when we're asking Black people to share pain, and it often draws away from the attention, away from thousands of instances of racism that have been common, which is white supremacy. But one of those instances that I do share, and it's recorded and documented, I share for many reasons because it resonates with so many. I remember distinctly, around a table where I'd gone to who I would call leaders and pillars in our LGBT plus mainstream communities and the activities that they run. A group of white gay men and women. They told me, and I apologize for this word in advance, they told me to fuck off and go back to where I came from. This was in 2004, 2005 times, when it was the setup and the formation of what would be known as UK Black Pride. When we're told things like that, go back to where you came from. I was born in Islington, and if you want to top up my oyster, by all means, go ahead. But many of those LGBT mainstream key leaders in our communities, they only live but a stone's throw away from Islington. And I have to ask them, would you go back to after Britain has stolen so much and maybe your place is not really here in the UK? So I guess for many of our LGBTQ plus people, when we never saw ourselves in mainstream prides, it wasn't reflected around our issues of religion, faith, belief, of being young and queer, the different socioeconomic statuses, class, poverty, so much. We were not seeing that in prides. We were not just there to celebrate and prance around and be happy and put the rainbow flag on us, because we couldn't just do that while we were dealing with the issues of racism, sexism, misogyny, misogynoir, everything compounded together. So it really became clear to me that UK Black Pride, I had to make sure it made sense. And, in doing that, we had and we have a Pride celebration that centres us, through the hurt and pain of setting up UK Black Pride. It showed me that our communities are resilient. We take our hand and make fashion. Even when we have no money, we come together collectively. Look, our rights have not been won by us standing still. There have been many that have come before us that made sure that they cultivated the land to ensure that we could stem it in its rightful path. But at the same time, our suggestions of UK Black Pride were seen as offensive. was seen as divisive and was seen as racist to the wider community. And clearly their understanding of racism was not very good, because I've never held, and nor have Black people, the balance of power in a world that tells us our beings are not welcomed. We've never been seen as superior. We've always been inferior, although I believe we are the global majority. So I guess the offence and the arguments is now the same as it was back then. You know, we hear, why don't you join the normal pride? And, you know, 16 years on after UK Black Pride was founded, you know, I asked the questions about what is quote unquote normal pride? You know, are you saying that Black people are not normal? This question has been repeatedly asked since 2005. And whilst it hurts a little, and it really does concern me with everything going on in the world, I have to just keep on keeping on, because the moment we just stop in our tracks, we don't achieve our goals. We don't look at our aspirations. But of course, there are many people around to help comfort, to hold, to amplify, to lift when we're dealing with our fight liberation. So I really want someone to ask me what would happen if UK Black Pride didn't exist, as opposed to them wanting me to justify the existence of UK Black Pride. Now, look, I digress, and I was saying to Maxine and Esther backstage that I can talk for Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, everywhere, the whole of Africa. So I want to make sure I utilize this time. But is the global crisis the crisis of violence and patriarchy? Or is it the abandoned refugees and asylum seekers? Or is the crisis of fascism? Or is the crisis of social media? Is the crisis faced by our trans siblings around the world? Or is the crisis about police and military and the forces that are placed upon us by state? What exactly is the global crisis that will be the catalyst for the change? Now, as a Black, queer African woman, a woman who's a mother, a woman who is, you know, in the moment and always seeking to strategize, there's no singular moment. There is no never the one moment of change. So many of us are constantly radicalized, energized, and animated as we move through the world with our eyes and our hearts open. So now we've acknowledged that the global crisis, or so I believe, the global crisis is not just one crisis, but it's many. You know, perhaps it's best I use the remainder of this time to think about and to share with you what I've encountered and reckoned with change. I think in formative and anxious moments that precede a big change in life, I find myself a little disorientated. I may have spent a life welcoming the inevitable and of change, but at the same time, each change feels brand new. And I've never quite fully prepared myself for how change calls on me to abandon what I knew, what I thought I knew, and how I might react to what I thought I might have, or how I have to navigate it. And, you know, in these moments, there have been many. I find direction, and I look to those who have come before me. There's the Combine, let me make sure I get this right. That's it. Combahee River Collective Statement is a foundational feminist text. And in it, they remind us all of a very specific ways Black women are made vulnerable. Over 21 pages, they take great care to prioritize Black women and affirm our position in struggling against multiple forms of oppression and the interacting systems of oppression. And in short, they describe intersectionality before it was even named by the amazing Professor Williams Crenshaw, but they paired it with a reaffirming clarion call. They said, "We have survived long against these great tides of marginalization and violence and even death. And we can do this. And the river collection reminds Black women that we are inherently valuable and that we have so much more at stake than our own individual liberation. So the map that is pinned to my wall and the work that I do and the collection and the books that I read, the richness that nourishes me on a daily basis, it's important and a timely reminder that separatism or indeed nationalism or any kind is not helpful. We do not get to where we need to get to without listening to those who are asking for the help, whose liberation is as essential as the world as our own liberation. And again, this statement compels me to really tell you that it's about the listening and the act, the calling and who's left behind or who's been silenced. And it compels me as well to remember that in any change or life is an opportunity for us, that radicalism is needed. This inclusive leadership is needed. Everyone that is in this audience today is needed. It also reminds me of the beneficiary of the generations of Black women who have laid the groundwork for liberation. And let us not forget that, this is how I encounter change, no matter the crisis. And we examine this in so many different ways. When we come to dig into the meat of it, or often uncover this existential question hidden within it. And so wonder if more of a generative or a helpful way of thinking about what is happening in the world right now is not whether a singular crisis will pave the way for change that we need to see, but rather what are the tactics employed by so many of us that came before us who met crisis after crisis and won? What can we learn from those whom have been at the most recent crisis, but it's not their first and it's not their biggest crisis? So to close, I really offer this, at the end of a long day, I sometimes wonder if we've forgotten collectively how to be human. It's hard work to be human and to move through the world as it remains to be connected to each and every single one of us. And the way we need to support each other is often hard as well when we're going through our own dramas, situations, trials. But for many of us to experience and to still remember and be curious and to laugh and to take moments to listen and to make sure that our hearts are well rested. I know that that's hard, but that's something that we've got to reach an angle for. So perhaps the crisis for me, and as I said, I was really thinking about this address to you all, but perhaps the crisis that we're facing is with the human heart. We're not designed to see so much trauma, so much inequality. We're not designed to see so much death and destruction that's happening around the world. And like many of us, my heart continues to break time and time again for all of us who are disregarded, erased, criminalized, penalized, singled out, or even killed. Like many of us, I have moments of doubt. Many of us, I sit and cry and think about where do I turn to next. But not all of us have forgotten how to be human. I feel so encouraged by the change that we are seeing, though I know we're nowhere near where we want to be. But to be a Black woman in this world and to see and to feel the world burning down around you and still knowing that the fire will be snuffed, and knowing that, I've since understood myself to be a Black woman in this world. And I know that I know, and I say that again, I know that I know I come from a long line of warrior women who have survived the unburned by the flames that continue to show itself yesterday, today, and it will probably show itself tomorrow. And I know who I am because I've been forged in fire. I'm often asked to speak. Sometimes I wonder if people are asking for permission. I wonder if me speaking here with you all today is offering that permission to you all. Not that you're seeking permission, but I guess maybe you need to hear it from a Black African queer woman who is a mother and who sees herself as a warrior and a fighter. Well, I give to you today the same permission that my grandmother gave me. You are allowed to rage against the machine. You are allowed to yell, and you are allowed to fight for change. And you are allowed to stand up for what is right. You're allowed to stand up against those who cause us so much harm. And you have permission to rest. And I say permission to rest because if we do not rest, we are no good to ourselves and we are no good to others. So you have my permission to love yourself, to hold yourself, and to love your loved ones, and do it so unconditionally and unapologetically. You have my permission to imagine and to let your mind run wild with the possibilities of great change and what that looks like. And that is really important. And you have my permission because I need you and we all need each other. So on that note, and I know I've spoken for a while and I didn't expect to get so emotional, but you know, when we're talking about our beings and when we're talking about ourselves and what we go through on a daily basis, our bodies are the struggle. Our beings are political, and never must we forget that. But collectively, I believe that we can really affect change, but we have to have a certain kind of unified voice, and we have to understand what solidarity means, because solidarity without action is nothing. So you have my permission, and I'm sending you love, and I close here by thanking you so much for having me. Thank you so much.